what makes a reliable CPAN module. I watched the videos from the talks at Riga, and I saw David's talk, and I thought, what a pile of crap. So I should, that was a joke, you were supposed to laugh. Everyone was looking like, oh, that's pretty aggressive, given he's sitting at the front. And it kind of prompted some thoughts I've been having at work, mainly prompted by the fact that we're having to go through ISO 27001 certification, and it's made us a lot more anal about a bunch of things. And it's changed how I think about what modules from CPAN we're going to use and rely on. And so this is kind of like a mishmash of those thoughts, building on some of the thoughts from David's talk. So what is reliability? And very often, well, it's just, I want a CPAN module that I can rely on. If you look online, you'll find loads of research about software reliability, and there's hundreds of models where people define the term. And this is kind of the common one from ANSI. So software reliability is the probability of failure-free operation for a specified period of time in a specified environment. For a CPAN user, what they really mean by that, I think, is, well, they just want the module to work right for their inputs from now onwards in their current and future environments. In this talk, I'm going to look at things both from the perspective of someone looking to use CPAN modules, but also from the perspective of someone who's writing a code and thinking about releasing it onto CPAN, or maybe you've got something and you want it to be considered a reliable module that other people use. All too often for CPAN authors, their model is, hey, it works for me, great, I can ship it to CPAN. So first of all, and I'm going to use Dave's kind of terminology in a number of places of proxies. So the probability of error-free operation. Dave talked about testing, and we've got CPAN testers, which every time something goes on CPAN, we'll run the tests, and statistics get aggregated on the meta CPAN. You can see it here, and so that kind of works out at 74%. There's a site, matrix.cpantesters.org, where you can go and see, and across the top of the columns are different operating systems, and the rows are different versions of Perl. And you can see there are some certain operating systems that have problems that have got more red, some that are very green. So this is a way you can go and see how well a particular module that you're thinking of using is working across lots of different platforms. It might be that it's working fine for you, then you go and look at this and think, okay, maybe it's not quite as reliable as I thought. But, so here's a module, and unlike Dave, I'm kind of happy to show some of the not so good sides of my own code. So this is the module I wrote for the Perl Weekly Challenge, and fantastic, it's got 100% CPAN testers results, but it's got 40% test coverage, and this is the test. Which is why I was curious about your 4%, because that got me 40%. Yeah, I get it. So then you could say, well, the probability of correct behavior is just multiply those two things together. So which actually for my module is 40%, which is probably about right, if I'm honest. So as we go through, I'm going to try and build up a definition for what's a reliable CPAN module. So a reliable CPAN module has high CPAN testers percentage with good coverage. Another part of that definition was for a specified period of time. And when you're using things on CPAN, you just want it to continue using. So if I start using it now, I don't want it to break at some random point in the future. CPAN testers also retains all the test results for all previous releases. So the figure that's shown on Meta CPAN is this one, so the current release. So you might be thinking, okay, this is nice and green, this is a module I can rely on. But you can go and look at the history of the releases, and that might tell you a very different picture. So looking at this, it's like, okay, well actually, sometimes there's releases done to CPANs that are really not quite so good, and sometimes they're good. Maybe this is not so reliable. But that's just listing releases. Then you need to think about, well, this is over time. So if it was bunched this way, so if this is time going across the bottom, then actually there was this long period of time where the official release on CPAN actually had only about 50% passing, so perhaps isn't as reliable. Whereas if it was this way around, well, actually there was a long period of time where it was very solid and stable, and there's a couple of flaky releases, but those got fixed quickly. So you want high coverage and high percentage, but you need a good history, and there's a way to find that online. Are any of you familiar with the bathtub model? It kind of is used in engineering and lots of things, which is basically when things are new, they're more likely to die, and when they're old, they're more likely to die, and in the middle you get a kind of a stable period. And the way to think about that for CPAN is when you release new code on CPAN, you should be doing developer releases, because you don't want your end users to be catching this, unless you're Microsoft. So do developer releases to kind of burn in your code, and then this is what people want to be using on CPAN, is the nice stable period in the middle. So looking back at that history, if actually it turned out that those were developer releases, does everyone know what a developer release is on CPAN? Does anyone not know what developer release is? So when you release a module to CPAN, you call it version 1.0. It says, okay, this looks like this is a public release, and it goes into the CPAN index, so that if someone then goes and uses the CPAN client or CPAN M, that's the latest version that's in the index. So if someone types install module, that's the version that gets installed. If you release it and you put a certain thing in there that identifies it as a developer release, it doesn't go into the index, so that most people using it won't install that version. But all the smoke testers out there will still download it, they'll run the tests, the results get uploaded to CPAN testers. So as the developer of that module, you can then see the statistics like, oh, that change I made has actually broken some things. So a reliable CPAN module burns in code changes with developer releases. When you release something to CPAN, all these smoke testers start downloading it and running the tests and uploading test results. I did a graph of, you can go and get all the individual tests. So this is a graph of over time from when the release was done, so the release was done at 0, how many test results started showing up on CPAN testers. And basically what that shows you is that you need to wait about a week. If you go and look at the history for lots of modules though, you'll see people release it, they see that first day of tests come in, which are typically all from Linux boxes. They're all green, that's great, now I can do a stable release. And then on day 4 and day 5, you start getting Windows or other operating systems coming in, and they're not so good. So a reliable CPAN module also has a patient developer, and I guess a developer that knows about how this aspect of the CPAN toolchain works. This is an example here. So one way you can indicate it is by putting an underscore in your module releases, the version number of your distribution. You can see here. Another thing you should do is look at who's been doing these releases. So this is from a distribution which had one author and it had a whole bunch of issues, and the author didn't agree that there were issues, and it became not a good module for everyone to rely on. It was then eventually taken over by someone else, and you can see the first thing he did was do 2 developer releases where he started trying to fix all the issues that were there, but do them as developer releases to see what CPAN testers said about it before he then did a stable release. So if you just looked at the historical view of this module, you might think this is not one to use. When you look at the author history as well as the release history and the versions and the use of developer releases, you can see actually this has switched to now where it is a reliable module. The other side of the graph, the bathtub chart, normal wear out, and I've called this CPAN bit rot. And this is some of the things that cause CPAN bit rot. So the first one is breaking changes in Perl. Does everyone know what the no dot in ink issue was that we all had a few years ago? So for a long time, so at ink is the list of directories that Perl will look for modules. So when you type use foobar, it will go and look in all those directories. And for a long time, by default, dot, the current directory, was in that path. And it made it easy, and lots of tests, in particular for distributions, relied on this to pull in test modules. Eventually, this got realized as a security problem. So, was it 528, I think, was the one where they said, right, no, we'll no longer have dot in the ink path. As a result, a whole load of modules on CPAN that had worked stably for a long time, suddenly the test, halfway through, started breaking. And so they've been working for a long time. They weren't actively maintained, but they were still reliable. But suddenly they weren't. Evolving toolchain and best practices for distributions. I'll come on to CPANs in a bit, which is the way to test, is this distribution playing nicely with the CPAN toolchain. There can be security bugs. If a security bug gets found and patched in Perl, that might be a breaking chain, but there might be security issues somewhere else in the CPAN system as well. And obviously changes to the underlying operating system, etc. So you want a reliable module to basically work on future versions of Perl, which basically means you want a module that's actively maintained. Pretty obvious, I guess. The other thing you want is that actually you want those CPAN testers' results to be reliable. It might all be green, but that might not actually be telling you what you think it's telling you. So some of the ways you can, as an author, kind of cooperate and collaborate with CPAN testers. If your module, if you know it's never going to work on Windows, there's a module you can use to say, so that when someone is trying to install it, one of the smoke testers is trying to install it on Windows, it can say, this will never work on Windows. That will then get excluded from the percentages, so it won't be seen as a failure. Similarly, if a module relies on C library, there's a thing that you can say, this needs this C library present, and if it's not, don't call it a fail. Whereas actually a lot of fails on CPAN testers for XS modules are because the underlying library hadn't been installed yet. The person realizes this, they then install the C library, install the module, but it gives the fake impression that it's not a reliable module. So there's a number of distributions like this on CPAN that you can use to basically communicate effectively with CPAN testers and give it hints. Specify the minimum version of Perl at your distribution. If you use the // operator, then put in the metadata of your distribution that this requires 5.010 or better. Otherwise, all the smoke testers that are testing on Perl 5.8 will report it as a fail, but it's not really, because you're not intending it to work on 5.8 or 5.6. Look at CPANs and quality. I'll mention that again in a minute. Make sure a pass really is a pass. So this was a module that I took over from someone else and discovered that actually a bunch of the tests that seem to be all passing very fine on Windows, someone on Windows said, actually it doesn't do what you think it's doing. I then had to do a whole load of developer releases to work out how to make this work on Windows and get this person to help me test. CPANs is a system that runs a whole load of quality tests. Dave mentioned this. This is not so much about the quality of your module, but is it following all the best practices for the CPAN toolchain so that CPAN testers and CPANs and Meta CPAN and all these other tools, they kind of rely on certain things being in the metadata, etc. And if you get a green light from CPANs, that basically means your module is playing nicely. Reliable CPAN module plays nicely with the toolchain. Does everyone know what the river of CPAN is? Does anyone not? Okay, a few people. So modules on CPAN, some of them are used by other distributions. An awful lot of them, nearly 28,000, are not used by any of the modules on CPAN. In the next bucket, we've got modules that are used by 1 to 9 other distributions on CPAN, all the way up to, there are 65 distributions on CPAN that are used by 65 or more distributions. If you look at, I have screwed up my slides somehow. There's supposed to be another picture there. It may randomly appear. Basically, there's going to be another graph here showing that the CPAN testers percentage basically increases as you go this way. So basically, as more distributions rely on a distribution, it's more likely to do well on its tests because there's basically more people shouting at them if they break it. When you go to Meta CPAN and search, you get this little blue picture that shows you the river, and if you hover on it, it shows you the number of direct dependents, which are modules directly using this module, and the number of total modules that are relying on it. There's the graph. I knew it'd turn up. So a reliable module is likely to be used by other modules. You also need to look the other way on the river as well and look at if you're thinking of using this green module, you need to look at its dependency graph. Because you might think, it's okay, I'm only using one module, but if it's using gazillions of modules, actually you're relying on all those as well. And your module might only be as reliable as the least reliable module in your dependency chain. You can find this graph on Meta CPAN if you go over here and click on this, and you get a graph. Let's say you want a module for downloading something from a URL. You could use URI fetch, which has a very simple looking interface, very high level, but actually has all these dependencies, or you could use HTTP Tiny, which has no non-core dependencies. So be aware. So it doesn't mean it has to have no dependencies, but it should have an appropriate number of dependencies. For a huge distribution, if it hasn't got any dependencies, it probably means they're reinventing lots of wheels. So hence the appropriate. A confession. I broke Smiler's code in production. I adopted someone else's module, and there was one part of the interface that looked badly designed. I looked on CPAN, no one else was using this module. I thought, fine, I can just go ahead and change this. Smilers came and gave a talk at LPW where he said Neil Bowers broke our production when he released this module with that change in. So a reliable CPAN module is backwards compatible. And there are some things you can do to make the interface for your functions and modules backwards compatible so that you don't break them like I did. But this was a long time ago, of course. I don't do this now. You've probably seen the thing saying release early. I don't like this because basically the bathtub curve, if you're releasing early, you probably haven't settled down on your API and you've probably got bugs. New releases have a cost. As part of our process that's come in with ISO 27001, in particular, we've got more cost on this. So this is a module where the author is just doing releases all the time. And without even knowing the details of this is not a distribution that I would be relying on, because every time there's a new release, you need to go. I need to go and look at it and see do I need to update. So release often? No. So this might sound like I'm a bit of a grumpy old curmudgeon, and ISO 27001 has made me this way. A reliable module, CPAN module, has a mature release process. So it's thinking about developer releases, it's thinking about all these issues and thinking about the fact that once it's on CPAN, you can't change it. There might be people out there relying on it, but you don't know. The other thing I found is that a reliable, more and more, I'm focusing on modules where there's a choice on one that does just one thing and does it well. I can't remember how Dave expressed that in his talk, but he has a similar thought. Another thing that I've noticed as well is you see code like this, and in the documentation it will say returns undef on error. And then in production at some random point, you discover that actually in certain very strange arcane scenarios, it will die, and that might cause you problems. So a reliable CPAN module has consistent and documented failure modes, and I'm just as guilty as everyone else as failing on that. You know, returning undef, but oops, something bad happened. The easiest thing is if I just croak here. So, if you're looking for a reliable CPAN module, then these are some of the things that you might consider, kind of distilling the things that I went through there. So, yeah, you might look at test coverage, look at CPAN testers, and also the history of CPAN testers, and look at the history of the releases and who's been making those releases. If you can see there's evidence of this person is doing developer releases, then that's also another kind of good sign. So they get a +1 for that. If it's actively maintained with a sensible release history, so the move fast and break things is not a good approach for a module on CPAN that lots of people are going to rely on, unless you document it as such. Modulicious have exactly that kind of thing of move fast and break things. But most people who are using it know that, so you kind of know what you're getting. Lots of other kind of small modules on CPAN, you just expect them to always work and to not change, and then not require you to change your code every time there's a new release. Slides seem to have not turned up. I had a slide somewhere on CPANs. Is it used by other modules is also another good indicator. And also, look at the modules that you're depending on that you might not be aware that you're depending on, and all the things that I said you might want to look at about the module A, you need to then think about all of those for the dependent modules as well. And I'm not saying no, never use the modules if they fail on some of these points, but about making a more informed decision. Since I've been thinking about these things, I've noticed that I'm basically just paying more attention, looking under the hood, and making a decision based on the kind of the more complete picture of modules. So that's it. I've got no minutes for questions. Oh, maybe one or two questions if there's one.
Have you used the reviews and the sort of +1 sort of process?
Yes, I do. So at the top where you can go and do a +1, yes, I use that. I used to pay attention to CPAN ratings. It's now kind of been disabled because the trouble was when a module gets adopted, so maybe a module was bad at some point in the past and there were reviews saying don't use this. Someone adopts it, makes a whole bunch of changes and now it is a reliable module. There was no mechanism for going and getting rid of that or for annotating it with a this is no longer relevant. So then someone doing a search would see, you know, there's a bunch of 1-star reviews for this and there was no way to get around that. So that's why Meta CPAN project dropped it. They hope to bring it back at some point when they can work out what is a way that actually is going to work long time, given that lots of modules get adopted and rejuvenated. Yep. Yep, question at the back.
I didn't get it when you said you broke someone else's module, so somebody else was using your module.
So I adopted a module from CPAN and there was some quirk in the interface. I couldn't find anyone else on CPAN using it, and it seemed a pretty strange thing to want to use this feature anyway. So I refactored the module, added a whole load of tests, and thought I've done a great job here. I released it. It all went green on CPAN testers, etc. It was actually several years later, Smiler's at a conference where he was giving a talk on tips on module development. Said that they were using this module and they released it and updated the module in production and their system promptly broke and it kind of broke in the middle of the night or something. So I could have said, why are you not testing your system before upgrading modules? But basically I thought I was safe to break the interface of a module and I forgot about DarkPAN, all the stuff out there that's not on CPAN. So that basically, once something's on CPAN, you really cannot break the interface because you never know what you're going to break.
You can break the interface, so this is versioning. So when they use the module, they should have logged the version to the one they use on review.
The trouble with CPAN though is that there's an assumption that kind of releases roll forward and people, you can't say in this code when you say I want to use foobar 1.23, there's no way of saying, and I want to stick at 1.23, so that even if then someone comes along and installs 1.25, you can't then have 1.23 still available for this code saying, I want to stick at this version. The CPAN toolchain and the use of modules, that just, I mean, there are ways you can hack it, but that's not ways that you know, people just don't use Perl that way. And so, there's kind of assumption in the way Perl works and the way the CPAN toolchain works is that you can always install the latest version and you won't break things. But people aren't aware that there's that kind of implicit assumption. Next speaker's giving me dirty looks from out in the corridor. Yes, in some languages you can do this and lock things down, but in Perl, there is no easy way, and the way that you're encouraged to write code in Perl and to use the CPAN toolchain just sets you up for failure if someone breaks the interface of a module from one release to the next. One more question? He's moved back. Oh, he's swearing though. Sure, a quick question. Yes. So
Dependencies versus 5 implied or whatever.
effectively, yes. So kind of the ultimate number of dependencies of your code is, you know, what modules get called in, whether you're calling them directly or whether they're eventually called by someone else. So if you're worrying about the reliability of your code, you need to worry about the reliability of all those modules, even the ones that are kind of 3 or 4 levels down in the dependency graph. And it's really easy to miss those. And looking at this made me kind of realize, holy shit, this module is relying on this other one, which is, you know, wow, I mean, I've been really lucky to dodge this. Okay, so it can be very eye-opening. Even looking on the river, there are some modules high up on the river, so depended on by lots of others, that actually their CPAN testers percentages aren't so good. So it is worth paying attention to that. You might get surprised, just like Smilers did.